Hi, so today we're going to talk about cellular respiration and fermentation. Cellular respiration is also known as aerobic respiration, which means that is the type of respiration using oxygen. And fermentation is also known as anaerobic respiration, which is the type of respiration without using oxygen. So we're going to talk about both of the types of both the types of respiration today. So the main idea from this PowerPoint is that living organisms obtain energy by breaking down organic molecules. That organic molecule is going to be glucose during cellular respiration, either during aerobic cellular respiration or anaerobic cellular respiration or anaerobic respiration. Living organisms get their energy by breaking down glucose, either with using oxygen or without using oxygen. Your goals for today. To summarize the stages of cellular respiration, so that's aerobic respiration, you're going to identify the roles of electron carriers in each stage of aerobic cellular respiration, and then you're going to compare and contrast alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation or anaerobic respiration. So let's get started. So the overview of cellular respiration. So the process of breaking down glucose or food in the presence of oxygen to release energy or ATP. So there are two types of cellular respiration. There is anaerobic respiration, which no oxygen is required. So you're producing energy without the presence of oxygen. And then there's aerobic respiration, which is when oxygen is required. The equation down here at the bottom of the page is an example of aerobic respiration because oxygen is being used in order to produce energy. So you need to know this chemical formula for aerobic cellular respiration. So that's 6O2 plus C6H12O2, which you should already know because that's glucose, is going to produce 6 carbon dioxide and 6 water molecules plus energy, which is ATP. You'll notice that this equation is exactly the opposite of photosynthesis. So this equation should be familiar to you already. You're just flip-flopping the reactants and the products of photosynthesis. So the types of cellular respiration. So again, I said there was anaerobic respiration, that's without using oxygen. And there's aerobic respiration, which is with using oxygen. Now, both anaerobic and aerobic respiration have an anaerobic phase. So that's, again, without using oxygen, without O2. And only aerobic respiration has an aerobic phase, which is using oxygen, with oxygen. Okay? So in anaerobic respiration, the anaerobic phase is glycolysis. And then it goes on to either alcohol or lactic acid fermentation, depending on what product we're making, either alcohol or lactic acid. There's no aerobic phase because anaerobic respiration doesn't use oxygen. In aerobic respiration, we start out with glycolysis, which doesn't use any oxygen, but then we head on over to the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which do use oxygen. So keep an eye out for that when we talk about aerobic respiration. So just like in photosynthesis, we have electron carriers in respiration as well. So cells use electron carriers to transport these high energy electrons from the breakdown of glucose to other molecules. So in photosynthesis, if you remember, in photosynthesis, we had the electron carrier NADPH. Now in respiration, we have the electron carriers NADH and FADH2. So how do you keep these straight? How do you remember that NADPH is for photosynthesis and NADH and FADH2 are for respiration? Well, an easy way to do that is note that NADPH has a P in it, and that P I like to think of is for photosynthesis. So if you don't see a P in something, then you know that you're dealing with electron carriers for respiration. So the reactions of cellular respiration. So we're looking at aerobic respiration here. So we start out with, we're going to start out with glucose. Okay, we're going to start out with glucose, and that glucose, actually I shouldn't call it a 1, I should say we're going to start out with glucose. So I'm going to highlight glucose here, nice big box around glucose. And then with glucose, we're going to be in the cytoplasm, and we're going to proceed to our first step, which is glycolysis. So in glycolysis, we are going to, that prefix glyco means glucose, the suffix lysis means to break. So in glycolysis, we're going to break down glucose. So that's our first step. So in the cytoplasm is where glycolysis takes place, and that's where we're going to break down glucose first. In glycolysis, we are going to get some products. We're going to get pyruvic acid. So from glycolysis, we're going to get pyruvic acid, and we're going to get some electron carriers in the form of NADH. So from glycolysis, we're going to get pyruvic acid, and we're going to get some electron carriers in the form of NADH. Pyruvic acid is then going to head inside to the mitochondria, and we're going to head straight for the Krebs cycle. Okay, so pyruvic acid, this is that line here. The pyruvic acid goes into the Krebs cycle, and the Krebs cycle goes round and round and round, and it produces electron carriers. It produces electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, and those electron carriers head on over to the electron transport chain. Okay. Glycolysis, so we go from glycolysis to the Krebs cycle, so that's number 2. And then the Krebs cycle produces these electron carriers, and our third step is the electron transport chain. So there's kind of 3 steps in cellular respiration. The first step is glycolysis, the second step is the Krebs cycle, and the third step is the electron transport chain. Okay. Now, each step of aerobic cellular respiration produces ATP. So we get 2 ATP from glycolysis. We're going to get some more, I think another 2 ATP from the Krebs cycle. And then we're going to get anywhere from 36 to 34 to 32 ATP from the electron transport chain, which should give us a total of 36 to 38 ATP total for this whole process. Okay, so again, we start out with glucose. We're in the cytoplasm. Glycolysis is going to take place. So we're going to break down glucose. In the process of glycolysis, we're going to produce NADH, which is an electron carrier, and that's going to be carried to the electron transport chain. We're also going to produce pyruvic acid, which is going to be our reactant for the Krebs cycle. That Krebs cycle is going to get going, and we are going to produce more electron carriers, NADH and FADH2, and we're also going to produce 2 ATP out of this process. Those electron carriers are then going to head to our third step, the electron transport chain, which is where we're going to be producing the majority of our ATP. And then 34 plus 2 plus 2, that gives us 38 ATP. If we're having a slow day, we might produce only 32 ATP, so we might get only 36 ATP. It varies. So glycolysis is anaerobic, so it doesn't require oxygen. It's located in the cytoplasm, so it takes place in the cytoplasm. The reactants are glucose, so we're starting out with sugar. That's why it's called glycolysis. We're breaking down glucose. And the products are 2 pyruvic acids, and we get ATP, and we get 2 NADH molecules. We in fact get a net gain of 2 ATP, even though 4 are produced because 2 are needed in the reaction. So really our products are 2 pyruvic acid, 2 ATPs, and 2 NADH molecules. So here's an example of glucose. So glucose, each ball here represents a carbon. So we have glucose is C6, so these are 6 carbon atoms. Glucose is going to be broken down. We're going to actually have to, we're going to use some energy and we're going to produce 2 ATP. We're going to produce 2 NADH molecules, and we're going to produce 2 pyruvates. And each pyruvate is a 3-carbon compound. So this is glycolysis. So we get our starting point, our reactant, which is our glucose. We get our products, NADH, 2 of them, 2 ATPs, and then we get our 2 pyruvates. Our next step in the in aerobic respiration is the Krebs cycle, and it is aerobic because it requires oxygen. Where does it take place? It takes place in the mitochondria. Okay. And its reactants are acetyl-CoA and oxygen. So pyruvic acid, our end product of glycolysis, reacts with coenzyme A to form acetyl-CoA. Will you be assessed on that? No, but you should know the reactants of the Krebs cycle. So that's acetyl-CoA and oxygen. Our products of the Krebs cycle are 4 carbon dioxide molecules, 2 ATP molecules, 6 NADH electron carriers, and 2 FADH2 electron carriers. So here is our diagram for the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is also referred to as the citric acid cycle. So I want you to be aware of this term, because depending on your the source that you look at, a textbook, maybe when you go off to college or AP biology, you might see the Krebs cycle referred to as the citric acid cycle, and I don't want you to be confused. They are one and the same thing. So the citric acid cycle takes place in the mitochondria, okay, and we are producing 6 carbon dioxides. We're producing 2 ATP molecules. We are also producing 6 NADHs and 2 FADH2s. This 2 NADH is actually coming from glycolysis. So next step in aerobic respiration is the electron transport chain. Now the electron transport chain is aerobic because it requires oxygen. The location is that it takes place in the mitochondria, specifically in the inner mitochondrial matrix. The reactants are NADH and FADH2, so those electron carriers that were produced as a result of glycolysis and as a result of the Krebs cycle are going to be our reactants here, and those energy carriers are actually going to fuel or provide energy to the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is going to end up producing ATP and water. And the electron transport chain is where we produce the vast majority of ATP that is going to provide cellular energy for the cell. So glycolysis and the Krebs cycle only produce small amounts of ATP. The electron transport chain is where the vast majority of ATP is produced. So if we take a look at the electron transport chain, here is our little diagram of the mitochondria, and in here we've got our little membranes, because the mitochondria is made up of both an outer and inner membranes, and the electron transport chain takes place in the inner membranes here. So you've got the mitochondrial matrix, which is in light gray, and then you've got the intermembrane space there in the dark gray, and you've got your energy carriers, NADH and FADH2, which are supplying energy, and they are going to pump hydrogen. So this is active transport. We're going to pump hydrogen across the inner membrane, the inner mitochondrial membrane, from the mitochondrial matrix into the intermembrane space. So we're going to get an electrical gradient here, and then these hydrogens are going to flow down their concentration gradient through facilitated diffusion. So there's a protein called ATP synthase. It's also an enzyme, And this ATP synthase, the hydrogens are going to flow through via facilitated diffusion, and this ATP synthase is going to rotate. And the rotation is fueled by this electrical gradient as the hydrogen ions pass through. And this rotation creates mechanical energy so that we can attach a third phosphate group onto ADP and make ATP. As a result of the electron carriers moving hydrogen ions across this inner mitochondrial membrane, we're also producing water. So for our energy totals, or the steps of cellular respiration, we've got glycolysis, which produces 2 ATP, the Krebs cycle, which produces 2 ATP, and the electron transport chain, which produces anywhere between 32 and 34 ATP. We're going to stay on the conservative side here and say 32 for a grand total of 36 ATP, but we can produce upwards of 38 ATP just depending on how efficient aerobic respiration is. So here's our overview of cellular respiration again. We see that glycolysis takes place in the cytoplasm. The Krebs cycle takes place in kind of that inner space here. The electron transport chain is going to take place in between the inner membrane and the inner membrane space here. Those electron carriers are going to fuel the electron transport chain to produce our maximum amount of ATP. And then we get small amounts of ATP from the Krebs cycle and glycolysis. So fermentation is the release of energy from food molecules by producing ATP in the absence of oxygen. So this is also known as anaerobic respiration because it's without using oxygen. So fermentation, again, does not require oxygen. It is an anaerobic process. And there's 2 types of fermentation. There's alcoholic fermentation and there's lactic acid fermentation. And as I said before, in biology, we're very boring. We name things after what they do or what their structure is. So alcoholic fermentation, as you can guess, produces alcohol, and lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid. So these are the 2 different types of fermentation. You need to know the reactants, you need to know the products of each, and then the example of where it takes place. So for alcoholic fermentation, our reactants are pyruvic acid and our energy carrier NADH. NADH is going to supply energy to break down pyruvic acid into the products alcohol, carbon dioxide, and NAD+, which is our uncharged version of NADH, that energy carrier. And an example of alcoholic fermentation is yeast. So yeast is used to make beer and wine. Wine is also used in order to make bread. And we're not really concerned when we're making bread. We're not really concerned with the alcohol product because that gets burned off in the oven. But we are concerned with the CO2 product, as the CO2 that's being released by the yeast in the process of bread making helps the bread to rise, and you get a nice fluffy loaf of bread. Now in lactic acid fermentation, the reactants are the same as alcoholic fermentation, but the product is going to be different. So pyruvic acid is going to get broken down by the energy carrier NADH into lactic acid, and then we're going to get our uncharged energy carrier NAD+. And an example of this, lactic acid fermentation, it takes place in human muscle cells. So if you've ever experienced like a burning sensation in your muscles, maybe once you've run the mile, or if you're exercising quite frequently, or you're breathing really hard, and all of a sudden your muscles start to kind of burn. The reason that is happening is because oxygen is not getting to those cells, and your cells need energy. So if they can't utilize oxygen in order to carry out aerobic cellular respiration, they're going to flip over to lactic acid fermentation in order to produce small amounts of energy. So both alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation produce small amounts of energy, 2 ATP total, but there's only 2 ATP as a result of fermentation, where you could get up to 36 or 38 in aerobic respiration. So lactic acid fermentation or alcoholic fermentation, not a great source of energy in terms of producing energy, but your body will flip over to lactic acid fermentation if your cells are not getting enough oxygen because they need energy in order to carry out cellular processes. This lactic acid is going to create that burning sensation, and that burning sensation is probably going to cause you pain, and pain's a good thing because the pain is going to cause you to slow down, maybe slow down your running, stop you from exercising so that you can actually end up breathing better, taking in more oxygen so that your body can then convert back to aerobic respiration and really produce enough energy that your cells need. So here's a diagram of cellular respiration and fermentation. So we see we both start out with organic compounds or glucose. They both start out with the process of breaking down that glucose in glycolysis. They both produce pyruvic acid and ATP, so that's 2 ATP total. Nice number 2 there, and a nice number 2 there. Then we go on through aerobic respiration, and remember this is the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And with here, the anaerobic pathways are either pyruvic acid to lactic acid or alcohol. Okay, with the aerobic respiration process, we're going to get more ATP. So remember, we get 2 more ATP out of the Krebs cycle, and then we get about 32 to 34 ATP out of the electron transport chain, just depending on how efficient we are, for a grand total of anywhere between 36 and 38 ATP molecules, whereas our lowly fermentation or anaerobic respiration only gives us a grand total of 2 ATP molecules. So here we can take a look at how cellular respiration and photosynthesis are metabolic pathways. They're truly opposite reactions. So the products of photosynthesis, glucose and oxygen, are the reactants in cellular respiration, and we're breaking down that glucose in order to produce ATP energy. And that mitochondria is producing water and carbon dioxide, which in turn are the reactants for photosynthesis, and then this just cycles through. So from this PowerPoint, you should be able to draw and label a diagram of the mitochondria. You should be able to explain the inputs and outputs of glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain. And you should be able to explain the difference between alcoholic and lactic acid fermentation and give examples of organisms that do each. Be sure to write down any questions that you have because this is a lot of information, and we'll review them.